Israel is up in arms against the United Nations again, working in cooperation with the Trump administration to impose sanctions against yet another UN institution after their campaigns against UNRWA and the ICC. This time, the target is the UN Human Rights Council after they published their latest investigation that incriminates Israel for systematic weaponization of rape and sexual violence against the Palestinians to the level of crimes against humanity as well as genocidal acts, particularly through targeting reproductive infrastructure and facilities in Gaza. Here to discuss the findings of this report and why it has put Israel in such a state of shock and disbelief are Hala Hanina and Muhammad Shahada. We are going to discuss this report. Hala and Muhammad, thank you very much for joining me today. So let us start with Hala Hanina, who is a social and political activist from Gaza working towards a PhD on violence experienced by Palestinian women under Israeli occupation. Hala has recently been writing about reprocide, examining the hidden gender dimension of Israel's genocide in Gaza. So, Hala, tell us more about this report that made Israel so angry.
Thank you so much, Ahmed, for having me. The UN report is not new. The information in it and the validation, the reports, the voicing of sexual assault, of reproductive genocide, and all of those atrocious crimes made by the Israeli army is not new. It has been already voiced by the Palestinians. However, to have it by a UN agency is something that Israel doesn't allow because it means that it would have audience. It would be heard and they might be held accountable over that. For that reason, Israel is trying to flag them and say that they are a terrorist group and all of that, as they have done with so many other people who have said or accused Israel of any crimes. And in the report, it's very important because it highlights multiple of the gendered aggressions and gendered crimes of the Israeli over the Palestinians. And it says that Israel have systematically weaponizes sexual violence, including rape, and other forms of gender-based violence and also reproductive violence or reproductive genocide since the 7th of October 2023. That doesn't mean that Israel haven't committed any such crimes before the 7th of October, but the report specifically focuses on that. The first thing the report focuses on is the systematic weaponization and routine sexual violence against Palestinian women and children. And in that, there is forced stripping of women and children. There is forced stripping and forcing them to walk in front of other people, of other Israeli soldiers, female and male, and also searching their bodies and harassing them. There's also complete beating them on their genitalia of women and children and cursing and humiliation them. After stripping women and children, they used to call them fat or smelly, or if they have their periods and they are in detention camps and they're denied of having any sanitary products, they would make fun of that and humiliate them because they're not able to keep themselves in a good condition. They're also threatening women and children of rape, specifically those held as hostages in detention camps, or to rape their families and their children in front of them. Actual rape of women and cases have happened, and cases are documented by Palestinian Authority and the UN have verified multiple cases. One of the cases where a child was harassed, sexually harassed, was on checkpoint while that child was crossing with her family on the checkpoint area by the Israel in Gaza, and the child was stripped naked as everyone else, and she was sexually harassed in front of everyone else to humiliate her, to oppress her, but also to intimidate men who were watching that and were not able to do anything and save the child from the sexual harassment of the Israeli soldiers. So Israeli soldiers didn't spare anyone, even pregnant women and women who have just given the birth after pregnancy were also sexually harassed. And among those women is a Palestinian woman just weeks after she had cesarean section. She was filmed by Israeli soldiers naked, and they said that or threatened her to use the video and shame her and spread it everywhere. Another pregnant Palestinian woman was threatened by Israeli soldiers that she will be raped in front of her husband, and they told her, "How do you want us to rape you, one by one or all together?" And this is very frightening and scaring for the Palestinians, not just because they threatened them, but because there are verified cases of gang rape, of raping the Israelis of the Palestinians. So the Israeli occupation army have also forced women and teenager girls to strip in front of their families and checkpoints and security corridors. The second point of this report is handling is the gendered violence against men and boys, which was horrifically used and weaponized by the Israeli occupation in this genocide, where dozens of cases of rape, forced sexual acts, full stripping, humiliation, beating on genitalia, and forcing men to curse their mothers, the prophets, the political leaders, their religion, and their families, forcing them to act as animals in front of the Israeli soldiers, and forcing them to lay naked or dance naked, and videotaping them. All of those incidents and all of those crimes were committed. Multiple of them were videotaped, and some of them were spread by the Israeli soldiers themselves who made these crimes. The
Thank you.
third point,
I think if we need to talk in details about this report, it will take us hours of giving examples. But let's talk more specifically about the allegations of rape. What are these allegations, and what did the report say about how the Israelis reacted to their soldiers raping the Palestinians?
the report was saying or detailed how the Israeli soldiers, Israeli media, Israelis, and also ministers, how they dealt with that, and they dealt with it um, with accepting it, with and there's so many examples of that, of ministers, Knesset members, journalists, TV hosts, and rabbis voicing their acceptance, their support, and their total impunity and support of the Israeli soldiers who have made that. There was a video published on the Israeli channel, 12 Israeli channel, and in that video, 10 Israeli soldiers were raping a Palestinian detainee, gang raping a Palestinian detainee. And after that video went viral, the Knesset members have defended the Israeli soldiers, not the victims. So they defended the rapist. The Israelis came and protested around the detention camp, defending the rapist again, not the victims. And there was one Knesset member who said at that time that if he is a Hamas, everything is legitimate. So he was talking about rape as a legitimate weaponization and sexual abuse as something legitimate to be used against Palestinians. So this is how they responded to the allegations, to their crimes, to their raping of the Palestinians, and then they are shocked and outraged after the UN have published how they committed those crimes, how they weaponized sexual violence and also reproductive violence against women and men and children.
So, Muhammad, let's talk more about the mainstream media coverage of this report. You know, we have seen mainstream media previously in the genocide dedicate much airtime to the Israeli allegations of rape and present an outpouring sympathy to the Israelis, being very sensational in their coverage of Israeli allegations and platforming these allegations without any verification. But how has the mainstream media responded to this report exposing widespread crimes of sexual violence against the Palestinians?
uh, Completely schizophrenic. So basically, I checked every single Israeli newspaper and media outlet yesterday, 16 of them, in the early hours of the morning, as soon as I saw the report came out. Every single Israeli media outlet covered it immediately with shock, disbelief, and dismay. They were attacking the UN Human Rights Council viciously. But when it came to mainstream media, I tried to check, and I checked like the usual, and I tried for many hours. I couldn't find a single word. I found maybe something, I think maybe an Associated Press, where it was just a generic coverage, very dry, very technical, tedious. It only says UN accuses Israel of attacks on reproductive health and, quote, genocidal acts. And it does not use the same sort of sensational coverage that we've seen before. There are still mainstream media outlets that have not said a word. A lot of journalists that sort of took this upon their shoulders as their own personal issue of feminism and human rights. They didn't say a single word, not a tweet, not a word, not a single segment on, for example, CNN, where you find journalists tearing and outpouring sympathy and describing Palestinians as beasts or savages or barbarians. You wouldn't find anything in the contrast when we got to the point of every accusation is a confession. There's also a very sort of deliberate effort to suppress the main findings of the report. So one of the main findings is that Israel is weaponizing. It's using sexual violence, rape, and attacks on reproductive health as a weapon of war. It's not an incidental one-time war crime incident. It's not a few bad apples. It is routine, it's systematic, it's commanded and instructed by people in the highest levels of power to do this as part of genocidal acts, as part of a systematic campaign. And you wouldn't find that in the headlines. You would just find UN accuses Israel of attacks on reproductive health. I've never seen anything like this. Like basically, Edward Said's Orientalism and Noam Chomsky's manufacturing consent. I've read them before. I've never fully understood them until this moment, until today, until the genocide in Gaza. Before they were sort of abstract. But now I see it very practical, very like visible, very tangible, and shameless. You see it every single day of the week. The contrast between what Israelis themselves say about themselves in Hebrew versus what mainstream media covers up and refuses to publish, it's staggering. There's like an insane, deliberate campaign of disinformation by omission. I've never seen anything like this.
Muhammad, why does Israel resort to sexual violence against the Palestinians?
So basically, the report itself lists a number of reasons. One of them is deliberate humiliation and revenge. So soldiers that have been told that are trying to dehumanize Palestinians, that are trying to prove to themselves and to others that Palestinians do not count as humans and that Palestinians are even less than animals, because the rules of engagement in Gaza for the IDF were this: you are not allowed to shoot a dog unless that dog is about to attack you and it has its claws and its mouth about to bite your flesh. But you're allowed to shoot to kill any human at any moment of the day without any accountability. So you find the same pattern where Israel is deliberately trying to dehumanize Palestinians in the eyes of their own soldiers, rank and file, and officers. So they resort to that kind of sexual violence, insertion of sharp objects into people, causing massive bleeds in victims, basically like to try to prove to yourself that the person in front of you is not a human and is basically a device, an object that you can do whatever you want to them. There's another layer to it. There's a layer of a vested interest in societal destruction. So basically, in the old days, you might remember when we were in school, I would have classmates who would show me marks, scars of wounds, of bullets on their bodies, basically from these Israeli rubber-coated bullets that were shot at demonstrators during the Second Intifada, nonviolent, peaceful demonstrators, including at kids. I'm talking about children in primary school. And those students, my classmates, would show these scars and say, look, I got this at a demonstration last month. I got this at a demonstration the month before. It was sort of like a source of pride for them that they sacrificed for the cause. And Israel itself found out that basically Palestinians in the first Intifada, before and after, they carried it as a mark, as a badge of pride and honor, that you were beaten up, held captive, tortured by the IDF. That's why they started resorting to rape systematically. When you are raped, when you are sort of abused in the most intimate way, it becomes a mark of shame to even speak about it, to share the stories even with your own family members. And the trauma it leaves you with, it is deliberate to leave a permanent mark of shame on people. The last dimension is genocidal acts. When you traumatize people in the most intimate part of their life, when you traumatize people in areas that are crucial to human survival, to reproductive health, you try to permanently ruin it for them for the rest of their lives. That it always evokes, it becomes a triggering experience. So, for example, there's an Israeli writer that wrote a few articles in Haaretz. She's married to a Palestinian man in Ramallah, and she's a left-wing activist. She dedicated a lot of her life to pro-Palestinian solidarity. And she says that basically when she would yell at her kids at home in Hebrew, the first image that would come to her husband's mind is the female soldiers that were torturing him at IDF prisons and Israeli jails. That's the first triggering thing. It's just her yelling in Hebrew. So when you traumatize people in a more intimate way, you try to restrict their ability to reproduce. You try to destroy, to damage their reproductive health permanently. And that's pretty much the goal, as part and parcel of a genocidal campaign to render Gaza uninhabitable and for Palestinians in Gaza to cease to exist as a coherent group, destructional group in whole or in part.
As Palestinians, Muhammad and Hala, how do you view this report? Is it sufficient, or did it fall short of expectations?
This report is very important, first of all. It's important because it documents, it validates, it shows the Israeli crimes that the Palestinians have been voicing all over the last 1.5 years, and even way before that, but just to focus on the after 7th of October genocide. So it's important to document and validate that. It's very important because Palestinians are dehumanized and silenced, and whatever Palestinians talk about and mention and give testimonies of is not listened by the Western media or the Western audience, and they only listen to Western agencies and agencies as the UN. So it's important in a racist environment for the international community, the Western governments to listen and hear that. However, it's also disappointing because it took a lot of time. It should have been out since a very long time. There's so many evidence. There's so many testimonies of Palestinians who have been detained, of people who have been at the checkpoint areas, of people who have been where Israel have ground invaded and they committed those crimes, and systematic weaponization of reproductive violence also, but also the sexual violence. So there is a huge amount of mountains of evidence that was there, and the report was so slow to capture them and get out with that. But it's understandable because we know the hostility of Israelis and how everyone is very careful around making anything against them. The second thing that's very disappointing is that it didn't call for actual action, and it didn't call for shaming Israel immediately for their reproductive genocide. It's a reproductive. It's something that we can't be light on it. It should be very clear and should be disapproved immediately. But the report didn't do that. They didn't shame them enough. They didn't put enough measures to account Israel. And this is the issue with the UN. Until now, the ICJ, although they said that there's a plausible genocide, they haven't been able to stop the genocide. Although the ICC have called for arrest warrants for Netanyahu and other members of the government, they were not able to actually put them in jail or hold them accountable or anything. So the issues in the UN as a body in its manifestation in the international community and the crimes committed in front of all of us is very disappointing. However, I wish at least that this report will see the light, will be dealt in better way than the testimonies and the voices of Palestinians that have been documenting those sexual assaults and also reproductive violence, genocidal acts against them.
Well, basically, it is remarkable to have this on record, to have it being voiced by the United Nations. Basically, a lot of the allegations in the report were voiced by Palestinians before, repeatedly over the past 16 months, never amplified by mainstream media. So once you have the United Nations putting its weight behind it, it carries a significant magnitude and connotation. On the other hand, there is some disappointment in the report itself. It came too late. Could have come way earlier than that. We've already had a mountain of evidence of sexual violence systematically occurring at the Israeli so-called security corridors, Netzarim, that was happening as early as November and December 2023, so about a year and a half ago. And the report itself, it tried to some extent use a very politically cautious, well-articulated language that does not generate a backlash from the Israelis. You see an element where they are clearly terrified of Israel and the US. So, for example, in an earlier, they would not sort of say that Israeli allegations are bunk, although they explicitly say we have no evidence. Israel is not collaborating. Israel is not allowing us to investigate. The Israeli interrogation of Palestinians on camera are sort of extracted under torture or gunpoint. It does not qualify as any evidence whatsoever. It is propaganda. Israel weaponized these allegations to justify war and to sort of rile up its own soldiers and officers to do what they did in Gaza. So they say all these things, but they shy away from sort of debunking it, outright calling out allegations that have been repeatedly proven to be false. But basically, the last thing is the recommendations not being strong enough. So when you have a mountain of evidence of this size, the first recommendation should be Israel should be immediately added to the UN list of shame of countries that engage in sexual violence and rape during conflict. Instead, what the report says, we recommend to the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres to consider, to look into, if it's possible, if it makes sense, if it's a good idea, which diminishes the authority of the report.
Muhammad and Hala, thank you very much for joining us today.